Hey, welcome to Conversations, a podcast where we seek out intelligent voices, voices that have been pushed to the fringes or have been smeared or ignored. We try to understand if in fact they have valuable contributions to give, and we do this by implementing some simple principles. Participants agree on some basic rules of conversation, but most importantly, they must see the humanity in each other. At a time when polarization is only increasing, while Western civilization is at serious threat of collapse, we believe these conversations are more important now than ever before. We hope you enjoy, but most importantly, we hope you take it upon yourself to have some of these conversations. Well, let's begin. Okay, so hello, welcome to the second episode of Conversations. Today I'm going to butcher his name, but I'm with Hrvoje, is that correct? Hrvoje Morić?
Hrvoje Morić, close
Hrvoje
enough.
Morić. Great. So Hrvoje is a teacher, academic, and he's the host of Geopolitics and Empire Podcast. Pleased to have you on.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So this is actually our third conversation now. We first discussed on Rico Brower's podcast, and then following that, I came onto your podcast, which was a great experience. We've had some great conversations, so hoping to continue that. Just very quickly, I don't know if you saw, but the podcast that we were both in with Rico kind of sort of sparked some of the inspiration for this one, and it was the whole candle idea of kind of a little bit of hope in the darkness. So just kind of going to make it my little ritual for this podcast of just light a little candle, and then the kind of agreement is that we'll speak honestly as we can, even though I'm sure neither one of us has a problem with that. But just to get started, okay, so here we go. Great. So kind of one of my inspirations for wanting to talk to people was, I felt that in the current climate of geopolitics and everything, there's lots of voices that are being pushed to the fringes, or they're not, or important voices that aren't really being listened to. So what I'm, hoping to do is get a better understanding of people's backgrounds and, how they've developed their worldviews, and what are some of those opinions that that could be valuable for wider people to learn and understand. So yeah, do you want to just maybe start off with kind of your background, which I know is a little bit of a crazy background for most people, but your background and a bit of history.
Yeah, just briefly, I was born in Chicago, so the U.S. So I'm an American, and I espouse a lot of the American ideals,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like freedom, the original Constitution, the Republic, liberty, free market, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of part of my philosophy as an American. But my name actually means Croat, so I'm ethnically a Croat. My parents emigrated from Yugoslavia, Croatia, in the 1980s, and then so I also have Croatian citizenship, and I feel in ways perhaps more Croatian culturally. And then so I studied history in Illinois. That was my first degree. But when you're saying how people are formed, right, where they get their ideas,
Mm-hmm.
I would say my first university degree, I actually learned more outside of class, because I feel like today the education system, from high school even to university, is there's a lot of indoctrination and a lot of controlled. It's very controlled, and so it's difficult to think outside the box. And so when I had some free time after my bachelor's degree, I did Peace Corps Mongolia. I only did 1 year, so I lived for a year in a yurt in Mongolia, which I absolutely loved. And then I came back, and I had about a year to myself, and I spent thousands of dollars on Amazon, just buying books and reading. And that kind of formed the first part of my education. Just reading on my own and not being told what I should believe, like at the university. And then when I started learning about 9/11, say what you want, but I didn't think much about the 9/11, what happened in 2001. And then it wasn't until 3 years later, 3 or 4, 2004, 2005, when like I said, I spent time looking at everything. Just all the evidence just leads me to believe that the government was somehow involved, and so that kind of turned my worldview around.
Mm-hmm.
And then from then on, I studied diplomacy in Geneva,
Mm-hmm.
where I had some good professors there that kind of molded me. And then I went off into the world. I went to Mexico, where I taught as an adjunct professor at the university there, and as well as a high school teacher. And I became a Mexican citizen as
Yeah.
well. And then one of the reasons I remain kind of where I like to teach both in high school and university is because it's easy to get fired from academia, from the universities, because of your political views. And
Right.
I mean, maybe later I can tell you some stories about that. But
Yeah.
so it's like it's good to have one foot, on multiple
Yeah.
footings. So if I get fired at the university, I get a job at the high school and or something else. So
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
sure. I mean, I guess that's maybe an interesting point to get into, because I guess part of the experience I've had of kind of me coming out about what's happened with Newsweek and resigning from there, I'm kind of seeing that it's a very, this is seemingly happening to a lot of people. It's not just journalists that try to report something. I'm sure it's happening to academics that try to say something that doesn't kind of fit the current story of what's going on. So yeah, do you want to go into that a little bit?
Well, I mean, I could tell you a story first. So when I was in Geneva, I mean, I'm sure you could look back in recent years and find plenty of examples. But when I was in Geneva, 2008, 9, I was studying one of my favorite professors, professor of geopolitics, um, and he has a summer courses that he holds. And one of his guests was Aymeric Chalprad. I can't pronounce his name right, but he's one of the top French geopoliticians. He taught at the French Military Academy. Very, very intelligent guy.
Mhm.
And in his book, he had published a book that covered a lot of topics, but including 9/11. And
Mhm.
he just included some factual information that could be read as I said earlier, that the government, elements of the government could be involved. He never said it himself because geopolitics, you want to present information as factual as you can, and then kind of
Mhm.
let people interpret it. Um, and so apparently after, because he was, I guess, so influential, and then he was blacklisted. So someone high up, I don't know where in the French government or European governments,
Mhm.
they kind of got him fired, and then he was blacklisted from teaching anywhere in any university in France and I think beyond.
Wow.
And we had coffee with him that one summer. I believe now he's in French politics. I think he's with the National Front, an MEP or something. I'm not sure,
Okay.
but that was just one example, and I could see other professors who were afraid. In the classroom, they wouldn't reveal everything that they knew because they were afraid of the reaction. Some students who
Mhm.
would rat them out or think that what the professor is saying is crazy. And so, but when I would talk to the professor sometimes outside of the classroom, they tell me a lot of stuff. And then when I was in Mexico, I think I had taught from 2010 to 2017. And then I think for 1 or 2 semesters, I had my courses taken from me at the university. And I was told by somebody that it was because my views of, U.S. foreign policy and international relations were, because they were challenging the establishment. And students, loved me as a teacher. There was nothing bad to say really about me. And it was someone, higher up took those for a semester or two, the courses from me until they were replaced. And so the person that came in had no idea, and I got the classes back. They didn't know who I was really, and so they gave me the courses back. And so you can see these examples of,
Mhm.
uh, you know,
Yeah. And do you remember specifically what you were kind of talking about at the time that might have caused a bit of ruffled feathers
I think it's just in general because I
in
was
general?
teaching different courses, North American politics, and it's just everything I was talking about was like documented, and so
Mhm.
it's just in general the stuff that I talk about on my podcast. That's one reason I do my podcast because I'm
Mhm.
free to speak about what I can what I want.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess in one of our previous discussions, you said something that was quite interesting because I guess we haven't mentioned this yet, but you live in Kazakhstan. which is also, I guess, unusual for people, but it's interesting because I guess it's a country that we've never really heard much about, other than kind of a silly Sacha Baron Cohen movie, even though it's pretty funny. But but you said something interesting about that, in that you said you kind of saw the trends in geopolitics, and that was kind of part of the reason that you decided to live in Kazakhstan. Have I got that correctly?
I mean, that was one thing. I was 7 years in Mexico, and so I was just kind of like, you're 7 years in one place. It's nice to try something new. And I really fell in love with Central Asia because I was in Mongolia previously, and I just love Central Asia. And Russian is similar to Croatian, so that that helps me out. And so, and yeah, as you say, Kazakhstan is really, I think, it's an emerging. Well, I guess you could say it was a frontier market, or is, and now it's really, I think, starting to develop. The 2.5 years that I've been here, so the school where I work at, I arrived 2.5 years ago. There was nothing around it. So we're talking about 2.5 years. And now if you go, I call it Little Astana, or as the capital has been renamed, Little Nur Sultan, like Little Italy. So I call it Little Nur Sultan. If you just, saw a picture, they built a huge arena that was just opened like a few weeks ago. And then there's just dozens and dozens of huge apartment buildings. So you can really see Kazakhstan developing in some areas. Excuse me.
Yeah, no worries. And so what's the driving force behind that growth, do you know? Losing your voice.
Yeah. I would say that, sorry.
It's okay.
People call it like the, got a frog in my throat. Happens to teachers, I guess, since we talk all day. I guess they call it like the Dubai, or of Central Asia. And this region, Kazakhstan, has the, I guess, largest territory, most resources. And something interesting, I was asked to give a talk at Shakarim University. So that's a university here in town, for over 2 months on the weekends. And something really interesting. So Shakarim University. So I think, and this is one of the reasons they're doing all this building in this town where I am, Semey, by the way, where they had the nuclear tests. The Soviet Union dropped 500 bombs. They dropped their first nuclear bomb 120 kilometers from here, and I actually visited the polygon. That's what it's called. So there's a lot of history here, and it's the cultural heart of Kazakhstan, Semey, where I am at. And you have the writers like Abay, Shakarim, and others that are from here. And next year is the 175th anniversary of Abay. And I think that's one of the reasons the government is doing all this building. And so this is the cultural heart here. And the university where I was talking, they made this year their first deal with the Chinese Shenzhen university, like a memorandum of understanding. And Shenzhen chose Shakarim University as the first university in Kazakhstan to make a arrangement with. And I was thinking they probably chose it because it's the cultural heart of Kazakhstan, so it has a lot of meaning. And then if you go back to 2013, Xi Jinping, when he the first time publicly unveiled the Belt and Road project, he did it at the Nazarbayev, with Nur Sultan Nazarbayev, at the Nazarbayev University in 2013. So that's really saying that Kazakhstan is a core component of the Belt and Road, of the Eurasian integration of the, as Velina Chakarova, one of a really cool analyst, calls it the dragon bear, right? The Chinese-Russian alliance. And so Kazakhstan is I think a big deal in all of this.
Yeah, and I guess from a geopolitical standpoint, I guess it's in a very interesting part of the world. So I mean, it's kind of in the mix between all those powers, right? And I mean, well, we could take it in so many different things. I was going to ask quickly, so in terms of, and for myself included, for people that maybe aren't really aware, and I think most people are not, what's kind of, how would you sort of summarize what like Kazakh culture is like, or what life is there, and how it might be different to like US and UK?
Well, I mean, and I'm still trying to figure that out because it's. I mean, the first thing you come here, you really sense the Soviet Union. You can still feel the Soviet Union. I'm big on science fiction and dystopia, so I sometimes I can feel like the dystopia. You know, I'm not a fan of I guess the Soviet Union or Marxism or communism. Although you know, Marx's critique of capitalism has a lot to say.
Mhm.
But you can really sense the difference between living like in the U.S. and Europe versus
Mhm.
living here. I mean, it's night and day in a lot of the infrastructure and things like that. So you can still feel the presence of what used to be the Soviet Union. The
Mhm.
culture it's very mixed. I mean, there's so many ethnicities, groups. You have like 20% Russian ethnic Russians here, Kazakhs, Tatars, Uzbeks, and so it's really a mix. And then what's fascinating is many Kazakhs. I mean, not many, but there's a portion of the Kazakh population that doesn't even speak Kazakh because of the Soviet um, history. And then
Mhm.
what life is like here in general. It's fine. Like I feel safe in Kazakhstan as
Mhm.
opposed to Mexico, probably where I was previously, but still probably safer than the U.S. too. So in general, I feel safe in Kazakhstan. The greatest danger is the weather. You know, so I feel safe, but there is that air of a dictatorship light, but that's
Mhm.
even that is kind of changing. When I first came, the internet was being throttled in the evenings, and some websites are blocked. And just over the past some months, that has kind of decreased.
Mhm.
So they do censor a little bit the internet, but otherwise you can go. I'm sure for local people, you can't really criticize the government. So there's that. But I mean, if you go apart from like getting too much into politics, if you're a Kazakhstan citizen, if you just live your life normally, I mean,
Mhm.
it's all right. And then perhaps the access to foods and things like that, it's more limited, you know, because of the cold and the distance. You can't get you know all the things you can get in other countries.
So it's a bit more restricted. Yeah, interesting. And so you've kind of been doing your Geopolitics and Empire podcast now. How long has that been going for?
You know what? I'm not
No.
even sure. I
Yeah.
think it's something like perhaps 4 years, because actually some years before that, I had a YouTube channel called Dissident Thinker.
Mhm.
It's linked as a featured channel in Geopolitics and Empire, so you can kind
Mhm.
of see the evolution of the channel. So on Dissident Thinker was when I was just Skyping from my university classes with
Mhm.
some of the really cool experts like John Perkins, the economic hitman, Paul Craig Roberts, Reagan's former Treasury assistant, Peter Dale Scott, Ray McGovern, former CIA officer.
Mhm.
So people like this. And so then, yeah, it's been about 4 years since I've started the proper Geopolitics and Empire
Mhm.
podcast.
And has your kind of like thinking evolved or changed, or well, I'm sure it has in like on kind of specific things, but I mean, kind of world or like on a more broader level.
I mean, a lot of my fundamental
Yeah.
beliefs of things have stayed, but yeah, I mean, for sure, when you're talking to people, um, I mean, one of my points, and I've heard you talk about it, I think, in your first podcast with Rico, is
Mhm.
just listening to everyone from with respect, you know,
Mhm.
and not scoffing at people because they believe in something that you might think is ridiculous, you
Mhm.
know. um I don't care what belief that another person has that I may completely disagree with, but
Mhm.
I'm gonna respect them as a person. And I'm not going to scoff at them, and I might disagree with them, and then we can discuss that topic, and
Mhm.
then I mean we're not going to talk about that all the time. We can put that aside, and then
Yeah.
enjoy a camaraderie. So that's part of the thing with the podcast, was talking with people from all walks of life, and I just learning to get like what I'm saying, learning to come together
Mhm.
more. But yeah, I mean, people can check out the podcast and
Yeah,
see
yeah.
the different interviews there.
That's great. And I guess one of the kind of main reasons I wanted to have you on is I feel like you give a really interesting perspective about geopolitics and maybe one that people in the West don't often hear very much. So I guess we'll kind of get to the sort of more nitty-gritty stuff of kind of we've had this very tense or back and forth situation in Iran, and prior to that we were talking about the OPCW scandal with Syria. So what's kind of, just we'll start general, what's your take on what's going on at the moment?
Well, I mean, I think we talked about it a little bit in the interview I did with you, but it's kind of what I've been teaching my students, the last decade. What I've been talking about is, if you just study history, right? You got to study history, study the think tank policies. You mentioned think tanks in our previous interview. The government documents, not just from the U.S. government, European governments and Chinese and Russian governments. And you kind of, I guess one of my things that I like to do is look at patterns, form the trend and find the patterns where a lot of people, they don't see these patterns. They just follow the daily news cycle, and they don't do this reading. I'm sure like you probably do this, and a lot of the people that are on the podcast, we do this sort of thing, that you really have to sit late hours reading this boring material. I mean, you have to do it, or you won't understand. You need to go read the Project for the New American Century. I mean, you need to go read all these boring reports. And like, I think war is baked in the cake. I mean, for me, it's like human history. We've never been without an empire. When has humanity existed without an empire? Never. There's always been an empire. There's always been war. And for me, I take the Hobbesian, or, as a Christian biblical perspective, that man's evil by nature, and so we have these wars, we have these empires. And when you're talking about like the Middle East today, I always go back to Wesley Clark. That's a good, where he said we're going to take out seven Middle Eastern countries. They've done all the previous countries, or they've tried. I don't see them stopping with Iran, and so it just and then on top of that, there's the historical cycle, where the empires, when Britain was in World War I, declining and Germany was rising for whatever reason that sparked it. They went to war, and it's just like, when I came to the Soviet, I'm not a former Soviet Union here in Kazakhstan, and 2 years ago when I visited Russia for 2 weeks with the Sharon Tennyson's Center for Citizen Initiatives, we met Gorbachev and Vladimir Posner and Russian academics and business people. And one thing that they told us was, people in the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990 could never have imagined that the Soviet Union would fall apart. And I'm sure you could say the same thing in Yugoslavia. And it's just kind of this normalcy bias that we think war's not going to happen, And in the previous interview with, I mentioned Peter Hitchens. I saw him say that we're in a pre-war period. So I mean, I think we're going to see war with Iran, but as I said, I think it's a little not quite yet. And Paul Craig Roberts, he said he wrote about this recently, saying that he thinks that through a third party that Trump and Iran have made some kind of deal, and that what happened, the events with Iran recently, maybe was like kind of a cover for Trump to be able to withdraw from the Middle East, as he had previously promised with his campaigns. I mean, that's one theory from Paul Craig Roberts that sounds nice, but maybe the military-industrial complex is not going to allow that, and invent some other scenario that keeps Trump in. So, I mean, I just have a more grim perspective, a realpolitik perspective, that there's going to be war. Maybe not 2020, 2021. But 5 years, 10 years, it's like that Pushkin, the playwright, the Russian playwright Pushkin. I think he said in the first scene of the play, if you have a loaded gun, I mean, it's going to go off by the end, by the finale of the play. So
but yeah, I think you kind of raise an interesting point, actually, because I mean, this might be a very unpopular thing to say, especially in America, but I mean, Trump kind of has been trying to remove troops from the Middle East, and I think probably it's you're kind of right in pointing out that it probably goes against the interests of kind of the military and the military industrial complex that's there. And I think that's probably why we kind of see this alliance between the Democrats and the intelligence community in the United States, and why we get all these Russia reports and Russiagate and Ukrainegate now and all that kind of thing. So with with that dynamic, and I guess with what we talked about with empire, something that I've noticed is I guess the nature of empire is changing, and I think we know what's happening with China with the Belt and Road Initiative. So I don't know if you share the same perspective as I do, that the American empire is pretty much in decline, and it is removing itself, and China and the kind of allegiances it's growing around it is kind of increasing in strength.
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking about that for, like I said, 10, 15 years. And,
Yeah.
that was one of the reasons I left the U.S. But I do think the U.S. empire is retreating, declining. But sometimes, like I said, like a good critical thinker needs to do is always question yourself. And then, sometimes I have doubts, like, maybe it will somehow extend. Something will happen that'll allow itself to continue. But I mean, I still keep that possibility in the back of my mind. But my first guess, looking at the history, just history in general, is that the U.S. in general, I mean, you cannot maintain. It's like a complex system. If you listen to Jim Rickards, he talks about like that's a little bit too far from my expertise, but he talks about systems and complexity, and it's like once you get to a point where you're, when you're building a new system, you put in a little bit of energy and you're getting a lot of output, right? But then you get to a point where things get so complex where you're putting in more energy than what you're getting back, and then eventually things get too complicated, and the system collapses. And I think that's like one of the keys to understanding empires. The system gets too complex, and there's too many inputs and variables, and at some point, a few things happen that just you can liken it to an operating system. Microsoft Windows. If you're screwing around with the code that's complicated, you're going to get the blue screen. So it's just kind of like that's kind of with the U.S. empire, and I agree that China is in the near term. China looks to be doing things following the rule of law and peacefully with the economy. But I kind of, in the long term, I'm not too keen on China, because I feel they are like a totalitarian at heart. Some of the things that you can see that they're doing in China now, and all of the neighboring countries. I've lived in Mongolia, I'm in Kazakhstan, I visited Russia. All these countries, none of them are keen on China or the Chinese.
So do you kind of see any, or maybe this has been a recurring theme in our conversations where I've been the naive one, and you've kind of brought me back to, but do you kind of see any like positive kind of path forward,
between in general, like with
I guess with China, like if China was to become like this global hegemon, would it, is there a way that it could be done without things turning authoritarian? And
well, I mean, I think we just have to look at history again. History is a good marker or guide, where, I mean, you've had empires that weren't so bad, that did good things, that did bad things, or maybe an equal amount of good things or equal amount of bad things. I mean, sure, China can help countries develop, like Kazakhstan now, or other surrounding countries. But again, for me, I feel like they're gonna be holding this. They're offering the carrot, but they have this stick. Eventually they're gonna have this power that can be misused, and I'm just kind of skeptical that eventually, like I said with Pushkin's gun, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. To go back to that, and yeah, I kind of have a pessimistic view of, I guess, empire in general, or concentrated power at a big level, unless there's someone else to check China. I mean, I don't think China is going to like become this unipolar power. They're with Russia, and it's going to be maybe more multilateral. But at the same time, you see some of the effect China is having. There's some articles that were written in Foreign Policy that we thought that we were going to change China's values to be more democratic and liberal.
Mm-hmm.
That hasn't happened. And now China is actually changing our values to be like more, authoritarian. And they talked about like, how the NBA and these big video game companies like Blizzard from Canada, I think they're from Canada, are kowtowing to China because they want that money. And so they're banning, the video game, Canadian video game company banned some famous Hong Kong gamer because he criticized China.
Right.
And so to appease China, they canceled his online video game account. So this means now we're accepting, because if we want their money, we're accepting these Chinese values now in Canada and USA.
Mm.
And so you kind of see this reverse inflow. And so and now what happened with the internet? I mean, like a week ago, where Russia and China passed some internet at the UN, they passed some internet rules, which the headlines. I mean, I didn't have enough time. I guess you'll have to read into that, but it's talking about putting more control on the internet. And so it's like, what if that happens, where China and a certain amount of countries take over or have more influence in international institutions, where they start to influence the culture there, in the same way where the U.S. has been influencing, as you were writing about the OPCW to their advantage, or how the U.S. Basically manages the IMF or the World Bank to their benefit, but to the detriment of many foreign countries. So.
Yeah, so I guess it's only to be expected that they will try to use their power to kind of wield more influence in the region. I don't know how much kind of this is within your range of knowledge and expertise, but I mean, how much do you think like having the dollar as the kind of world currency on most issues, how influential that is on like geopolitics? And like,
no.
Because I guess the trend that I'm seeing, but I guess I don't know I'm not an expert in this field, but I think you start to see this trend where more and more countries are trying to get, move away from the dollar. And, even with Libya, I think, some of the overthrow of Gaddafi was, a lot of people say that it was linked to the fact that they were trying to move away from the dollar as their, then, I forget the exact term, their nominal currency, I think, for payments and things like that.
Yeah, this is something I talked about in my university classes, the petro dollar. And, I think it's crucial, the US dollar to US power. If they didn't have the US dollar as the world reserve, we wouldn't be talking about the US empire. If we go back, I think I think we can start with, Saddam in the late 80s or early 90s was talking about trading oil in euros. And one of my professors was Saddam's defense lawyer. He's a Dutch American, Curtis Dobler. They asked him to be part of the defense for Saddam in 2003-4, which was a kangaroo court, the kangaroo trial. They hanged him, so dead men tell no tales. And so Saddam was talking about trading oil in euros. Then Gaddafi with the gold, and then so it's definitely key, the petrodollar. So that deal was made with Saudi Arabia. I think Roosevelt back at the end of World War II was making deals with Saudi Arabia, and then the deal for the GCC or the OPEC to exclusively sell oil in dollars. So this is the key support for the U.S. empire. And so what you're talking about is this de-dollarization. So I like, from my vantage point for my podcast, I get to interview people who are experts in this. And so I get some people who say, de-dollarization is happening fast, quickly. And then there's others that say, no, it's slow, and it's going to take, decades and decades. And more and more, I'm coming to the view that it's going to happen faster than people think. For the people who say that it's going to take longer, they look at like the IMF data that says, I forget if it's like 60% of the word 60% of the world's money is like dollars are used, and then if you compare like the yuan, it's like 3%, and it's a huge difference.
Yeah.
But Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, recently spoke about how he believes in 5 to 10 years that the yuan is going to catch up to the dollar, and I think that's possible because what they're doing now, China is creating their first state-backed like crypto digital stable coin yuan, and everyone who uses WePay or was it WeChat, Alipay, and those digital platforms, they're all going to start using the yuan digitally, and that's going to extend to the Belt and Road. And so with that, I feel like, if the yuan is here and the dollar is here, this new paradigm of the technical aspect, the yuan is going to catch right up to the dollar. And I think I'm kind of that view that that's what's going to happen. And as that happens, the dollar is going to lose its standing, and with that, the decline of the U.S. empire.
And I guess, another factor in this is how much money the United States owes to China, right? Do you think that's a factor in this whole process, or?
Yeah, it's like a game of musical chairs, right? So it's like the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, everyone else holding U.S. debt. It's like no one wants to be the first one to sit down, because then the whole thing is gonna come crashing down, and not everyone's gonna get their return on their dollars, right? So some countries will be left holding the bag. So that's why no one's. It's a musical chairs, and no one's there yet to really be the first to sit down and really start this thing off, because when it starts, it's going to be crazy. And I think countries are now preparing. They're preparing for this. You see, I was shocked to find that Kazakhstan, 50%, half of its, I think, foreign reserve holdings are in gold. Russia recently just talked about converting their foreign reserves into gold. Many countries, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, China, Russia, they're all, central banks are buying gold like crazy. And so you can really see they're getting out of the dollar. They're making the deals like between Iran and China, and Russia, between China and to trade without the dollar. In fact, China, I told you Kazakhstan was crucial for China. Just a few months ago, it was announced that they're opening in Kazakhstan a clearinghouse for the yuan. So that means yuan will be able to come in and into Kazakhstan, and I believe it'll be able to be quickly converted, I don't know, into the Kazakh tenge and used in Kazakhstan. And so you see all of these systems deploying, and so yeah.
And I think it seems to be like this has been a kind of evolution in the shape of what empire looks like, I guess, because the American way has always been having essentially a proxy government for US interests. They'll overthrow someone and or try and have a government that favors their interests, whereas China's kind of not doing it with any force. It's just doing it through loans and infrastructure spending and things of that nature.
Well, the critics of the Chinese say it's kind of like what you're saying. They're not going to impose, like, yeah, you're right. The U.S. just came in and overthrew and put in physical puppets like Saakashvili in Georgia in 2003, or whoever you want. And what the Chinese will do, they're not going to do that. See, they're creating the technological platforms. They're ahead in the AI. I think they said in 5 to 10 years, China's going to be number one in AI. You can read AI Superpower by Kai Fu Lee, I think. Amazing book. I mean, that totally convinced me that China's like already won in the AI war. And so they're creating the platforms that everyone will have to use, the apps, the all these systems. And that's how they will be able to control things, because they'll own like a large part of that economic system. And so if you don't play by their rules, well, then you're like locked out,
Cool. And I guess maybe a little bit more generally, like, do you see other kind of trends happening in geopolitics that are kind of important to be aware of at the moment?
Let's see. The economy. I'm thinking the economy is the big first trend, the first shoe to drop. Again, if you go back into the historical imperial cycles. You know, the economy goes um, first, and then we have the wars.
Hmm.
You know, Africa. Some people say Africa. I was
Oh,
talking
that's,
to
yeah. I mean,
some guests that Africa won't um, develop really so much, but I think there's a lot of potential for Africa that it is. I think it was just written recently that like most of the top 10 countries that have the most entrepreneurial activity are in Africa, and
mm,
so I think Africa is going to start developing a lot more.
mhm,
Um, I think one of the keys is regional integration. We're going to start seeing countries cannot function as countries anymore. You got to join the club. So you have like the EU, European Union.
mhm,
Um, and if you saw a few weeks ago what happened with Putin and Belarus, his president Lukashenko, they signed an agreement to unify their parliaments. So you're having two different countries unifying
uh-huh,
their political parliaments. And
mhm,
this is actually part of the idea for the Eurasian Union. And I wouldn't be surprised Kazakhstan will join that, and then the
mhm,
other countries in this region. So in order to compete now, you
mhm,
cannot be nations. You have to be part of the EU,
mhm,
part of the Eurasian Union, the African Union, the South
mhm,
American Union. There's a few prototypes of that. You have Mercosur, UNASUR, the Union of South American States, and Ivan Duque, the president of Colombia, has just proposed ProSur, which I think is US backed. So I think which one of those will win out and be that regional model for
mhm,
South America. And so I think this is like one of the most important issues in geopolitics going forward. You know, the Council on Foreign Relations, which you've talked about, they had an article from 2010 that stated, you know, they wanted a Middle Eastern Union, and in fact, they had wanted the GCC to have a common currency by 2010. Obviously, they're way behind, and they want an Arab NATO. So you see this trend of regionalizing the economic system. You know, to have one currency with between the Middle Eastern countries, to
mhm,
have a type of NATO in the Middle Eastern countries where they unify
mhm,
their military forces. So I think this is one of the biggest trends that you'll be seeing in the coming, you know,
mhm.
10, 20 years.
And I don't say that, I don't think this necessarily disagrees with your point, but maybe it's something that's happening at the same time. But I think, like in Europe, you're seeing like the opposite process, right? Because you're seeing like Catalonia's trying to, leave Spain. We have Brexit. I'm sure that there's, Scottish independence, and so it seems like, countries are trying to break away in Europe, not actually. And it seems like the European Union I mean, a lot of people are starting to lose faith in it, as an institution. It seems, and yeah, I mean, it's part of a wider sort of trend of nationalization. How do you see that fitting in?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you. I think it's part of the process. You know, you know, when you're trying to build like let's say a clay statue, you chisel off a lot of stuff, or it's just this part of this process building this structure or institution where you get kickback. Um, so that's just natural. I don't know. As I said, maybe you know if some of these countries leave and try to be independent, they might, like as I said, later discover that you won't be able to function as one single nation state among regional unions. You just won't be able to do that. When you talk about Brexit, some people have written about this. Kind of my crazy idea about if Brexit goes through, I think it probably will. Um, that if you go again back to the 1940s, there was this plan by these think tanks or scenario of the Atlantic Union, like a European Union, but Atlantic Union
Hmm.
between Britain, USA, Canada, and then there's been talk about the U.S. Trump making a trade deal with Britain, free trade deal or whatnot. And so we know that a lot of times these unions begin with free trade deals. That's the first layer, and then after you saw with the EU, you start with these economic trade deals, and then you build the political unification, and then the military. They're talking about the EU army now,
Hmm.
and so I wouldn't be surprised if Brexit, if Britain just joins eventually this Atlantic Union with USA, Canada, and maybe even in Mexico, because there's that idea of this North American union. And so I think that's just a natural part of the process where people kick back. They're kicking against the pricks. But also, as you say, the EU. I'm not a fan of the EU because if you look at it, it's anti-democratic in nature. You have Soviet dissidents who call, who've lived under the Soviet Union, and they go to the EU and they say it's the new European Soviet. It's got a lot of unelected bureaucrats.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see in some of the founding fathers, like John Monnet, I think in some of his diaries, he mentioned, there's some letters, I mean, it's documented. You can go look at this. He mentions that something to the tune that it's anti-democratic. And then you look who funded the EU project. 50% of the funding, this is academic paper written about this, came from the CIA and the State Department. So the EU is kind of a US imperial geopolitical project. If it's easier to control Brussels, one capital, instead of controlling 30 capitals. And I always tell the story of my grandmother who died, I think, in 2008 in Croatia.
Mm-hmm.
In Croatia, we make our homemade wine or homemade rakia, hard liquor, in the village, and everyone does that. And so it was 2008, so we hadn't joined the EU until 2013, and there were already back then these talks that they're going to start taxing. If you make homemade liquor, you're going to have to pay a tax, even if you don't sell it. If you just consume it yourself, you're going to have to pay a tax. And she's like, I'm glad I'm going to die before that happens. And then, surely enough, she died of old age. And then we joined the EU, and I think that they're starting to. I don't know if they've already implemented this or they're planning. So you see what I'm saying? It's just kind of this.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I had the view personally of I was very anti-Brexit at the time, just because I'm sort of a very international person. I grew up in the Middle East. I lived in the United States and then UK. Had a bit of time in Europe, so I was kind of just opposed to it from, from kind of a selfish interest of just wanting to be able to live wherever and be able to travel freely. But now, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm for Brexit, but I definitely, understand the kind of people that say that they're for it purely from those kind of arguments and a few others. So I'm still, I guess, I don't really know how I feel about it just yet. I think it's going to be one of those things that you'll see. I mean, kind of have to see how it plays out. But it's interesting to see. I'm not sure where to kind of go from there. But trying to think what else we haven't covered. I mean, what do you think? And in terms of how much do you know about the Belt and Road in terms of what they're doing in Africa? Are you aware of?
Well, I haven't studied that too much in depth, but
do you know that they're
again, there's mixed. Again, you're finding mixed views, and then a lot of the obviously the Western media is going to criticize it, and they're talking about the debt trap diplomacy. We know, for example, the Chinese are exporting a lot of their surveillance and the equipment that they were selling or helping the African governments with countries with. They were installing surveillance, into their embassies and spying on the same African country. So that kind of goes back to what I'm saying about the nature of man and empire. We have the whole NSA thing. So America's spying, Europe is spying on everyone. Well, so are the Chinese. That's just everybody does it. And I guess one of the bad things about what the Chinese are doing in Africa is they're bringing in so many Chinese. I'm not sure if I remember, it's like 2 million Chinese that are in Africa now. They do all the work. And so, but on the other hand, I think that the Africans get more bang for their buck from the Chinese than they did from the US. So, I mean, in that respect, they're probably getting more than from the Chinese than from
I think what you kind of mentioned before, I think Africa is actually going to be really interesting to watch from a geopolitical standpoint, because I read something fairly recently which said that the United States actually has more troops stationed in Africa than anywhere, sort of any other continent. Well, I have to kind of check, but I think there's a very large presence of U.S. troops, and there's a lot of kind of covert operations going on, and Somalia and all that kind of thing. So I think there'll be interesting geopolitical developments. I'm not sure if they'll be for better or for worse.
I had maybe another question or topic to raise that I always think about, and what I mentioned, and I think you've mentioned in previous interviews, this, when you left Newsweek, and just this idea of like cowardice, like being brave enough to speak out, and risking your livelihood to do it. And living here in the former Soviet Union, I've heard stories about people's lives in the Soviet Union, and even now in Kazakhstan, where they can get into trouble. And you can understand different people. Sometimes they have situations with I don't know, family, extended family, or just all kinds of different situations where if they spoke out, they would get, they would have serious problems in life. But then there's a lot of us who aren't in that position. And I kind of I just tend to speak my mind and not really thinking or caring about my security of job, because I think it's more important just to tell the truth. For me, the truth is the truth. And I'm like, hey guys, look what's happening. And I kind of don't think about my job. And I think for me, that's just a fascinating thing. Why do so few people they don't take this leap of courage, and they just stay silent? They don't speak out. They're afraid. For me, I don't know, maybe if you could talk a little bit about this, or from some people you've spoken to, because I think this bothers me that so few people are willing to stick their neck out.
Yeah, well, I think, I might be going on a slight tangent here, but I'll try to sort of bring it back. But I'm sure you've kind of heard this perspective yourself, but something that's often repeated, or I've heard repeated throughout my life, is people, when they talk about the Nazis, they always kind of say, they're so evil. How could that have ever happened in humanity? And I think what happens is people forget that they were essentially human beings. The country, it's a bit, Germany was a big country. There was a lot of people that lived in this country that kind of did this behavior. So to kind of say that, or even the Soviet Union, there was, big country, and it was doing, even though that was more its government, but there was hundreds of people that were complicit in the crimes that were taking place, and prison guards, or just even sort of day-to-day administrative roles. You're knowingly participating in something. And but I think that attitude is part of the problem, and Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, in terms of you have to kind of understand that you have the capability for evil in yourself before you can kind of overcome it. But I think what kind of happens is that small lies, or small falsifications, or small deceptions grow and grow and grow. I don't know if you read, to the point that they reach the point that, we read about them in history books. I don't know if you read Alexander Solzhenitsyn, his Gulag Archipelago, but just about how, despite being imprisoned for I don't know how many years, I think 15 years, he still kind of blamed himself, I think, for being imprisoned. He didn't blame it on the Soviet system, and he was saying he was blaming the whole of the Russian people, because it was saying we only got to this point because no one was able to tell the truth. But yeah, I think so. I definitely share that sentiment of people need to tell the truth, and I think also the truth is painful, right? It's to tell the truth is to change your mind about something. or to accept a truth. That's also a painful thing, because you essentially have to your current belief system has to crumble to the ground. You have to admit that my old belief system was wrong, and I have to kind of go somewhere new. So I think, and from a psychological point of view, I think that's some sort of ego death. People they have their identity, they have their worldview, and it can be extremely stressful of your. And actually, this happens to me fairly regularly, but not. But it's when I read a lot of philosophy and I read a lot of books, but sometimes I'll come across new ideas that I hadn't fully considered, or something, will tweak my worldview, and I'll actually kind of go through maybe sometimes a week-long depression, where I'm processing the new information, but because it's like altered my view of the world so much, it kind of nothing makes sense anymore in my world around me. But then sort of what happens is, kind of slowly, as like my mind sort of gathers together the pieces and maybe forgets things that are no longer relevant, I kind of come out in a better place afterwards. But I think, yeah, I mean, from my experience of speaking truthfully about what happened at Newsweek, my life's, even though it's a little bit more stressful and unstable at the moment, I'd say that my life's definitely better now than it was when I was at Newsweek, even though I'm not sure where my next income is going to come from, and but that kind of thing. But in terms of how I feel about myself, my self-dignity, and I've had a lot of messages of support from people, and I think we're reaching that kind of time in society where truth is kind of lacking in so many fields. It's not just academia, it's not journalism. I think people are they know that there's just so much deception around them, and I think, interestingly, we criticized the Soviet Union when Solzhenitsyn came to, or he was in prison, and when he came to the US, and now I think we discussed this the other day, we have Snowden in Russia. So it's actually like we have this flip, and the whole freedom of speech is not alive in the US as it used to be. So yeah, I think the country is becoming more and more authoritarian, and unless people start kind of speaking truthfully, it will start looking like some of those really nasty regimes from the past. Well, I guess well, not the most positive notes to end on, maybe, but again, the whole theme of this podcast is, yeah, trying to get people to speak as honestly as possible, just even though we might have different views or whatever, so like we discussed. But where can people find your work, and how support you and all that?
Yeah, I guess geopolitics and empire.com is the website. And if it's the big help is just signing up, subscribing to all the social media, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and just sharing the podcasts. Some weeks I miss because I'm really moonlighting so far as a podcaster, and so I hope to be doing this in the near future, to spend more time doing it, because I don't have as much time or resources at the moment. So geopoliticsandempire.com. There's also the email newsletter, which I had started up. So I try to collect each week the headlines, which I think are the most important, that show the kind of like the trends, the patterns that I see. And so if you find that valuable, I mean, sometimes there's a long list of links that you can click on the ones that you think are interesting, but I try to send that out once a week together with the podcast.
That's great. And I guess just one final question. Okay, off the top of my head, what book are you reading at the moment?
One of my next guests' books, Trump, Xi Jinping, and the New Struggle for Global Mastery by Richard Haydarian. And he's really good geopolitical analyst, and it's basically all about how we're in a new Cold War with China. It's a bipolar world. So that's basically the background for everything that's happening now. And then I just started reading it, and so he's going to start getting into the dynamics in Indo-Pacific. So with that context, what's happening in the Indo-Pacific?
Amazing. Okay, well, best of luck going forward with your podcast. I'm sure we'll talk soon.
All right.
Thank you.